I wanted to share real quickly who these amazing people that we have are here coming to talk to us for tonight. So first, we have Doris on the phone. Doris Meissner is the former commissioner of the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service. So we really want you to hear from her. She's a senior fellow at the Migration Policy Institute, where she directs the Institute's U.S. immigration policy work. She is a member, you got to listen to all these things, guys. She's a member of the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations, the Inter-American Dialogue, the Pacific Council on International Diplomacy, National Academy of Public Administration, Constitution Society. She's very well connected on this issue. And then we also have Heidi Altman, who is the Vice President of Policy and at the National Immigration Law Center. She previously served as the Director of Policy at the National Immigrants Justice Center and Legal Director for the Capital Area Immigrants Rights Coalition. And her work focuses on legislative and administrative advocacy for the rights of immigrant communities. So we are in good hands having these conversations. I'm going to add a spotlight for Heidi, and then Doris, we're going to bring you up as a phone, but I think it won't let me spotlight you, but we know you are there. So if you want to be unmute, that is perfect. All right,
All right.
we're going to start.
Can you hear me? Because I think I'm unmuted.
Yes, we can hear you now. All right,
All right,
Doris,
great.
so
Thanks.
we're going to start with this first question. Can you just explain how did immigration to the US even begin? Like, what were the first immigrant policies and attitudes towards immigration?
Well, thank you so much, and I'm really sorry that for this technology issue, because I'm really pleased to be with you and very pleased to learn about the work that you're doing, and that we can talk about these issues as part of your interests. So, we have to start with the basic thing that we all know, which is that we are a nation of immigrants, and we're a nation of immigrants because our country, America, the United States, was certainly peopled by indigenous people, but when Europeans began to come, that's the origin of our saying that we are a nation of immigrants, because Europeans began to come basically in the early 1600s. And although we have had immigration throughout our history, actually our immigration has come in four waves, four basic periods. And so our immigration has waxed and waned, and some of the waxing and waning has to do with what the difficulties can be when there have been periods of low percentages of immigration, and then you get high percentages of immigration. But I just quickly go through the four waves. I mean, the four waves were the original, I think, peopling of the United States, and that included the first groups that were forcibly brought here, which were African Americans, of course, from Africa. But the second wave, but the Europeans who came in the first wave were basically looking to escape religious persecution and other oppression, and they obviously established the colonies, etc. The second major wave was basically the opening of the West, the middle 1800s, and the opening of the West through the middle 1800s up until about the 1850s involved Northern Europeans, mostly British, also Scandinavians, to a considerable extent Germans, and then Irish. And then we get the Civil War, which breaks immigration, and it picks up again in the 1880s and goes until the end of the First World War, and that coincides with the industrialization and the Industrial Revolution and the creation of the big industrial cities in the Northeast. And then immigration stops again until the 1970s. And the wave that began in the 1970s continues today. The difference between those earlier three waves and the wave today is that those earlier three waves all basically involved nationalities that were from different parts of Europe. And although it went from the British Isles to Northern Europe and then to Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, nonetheless, that European migration is what defined us until the 1970s. And in the 1970s, we began to see migrants from Asia and Latin America totally overtake the European migration. and we can talk much more about that as we go on, but that's the overall sketch. And I think that what I would have to say is that with every single one of those waves, there has been exceptional tension between basically the desire for labor and workers and nativist responses, people that believed that immigration was replacing them. And so the immigration story is one that is laced with rivalry and with tension, and but it has overall also followed our economic evolution as a society and tracks very closely with the different economic periods that we've gone through to become a productive country.
And Doris, thank you so much for that. And the next question I was going to ask, and I'll start with Heidi if she wants to weigh in on this, and we can come back to you too. So has immigration only, and you kind of touched on this, has it always been as politicized and polarized as it is now? Or is this something that's exclusive to the time period we're living in?
Thanks, Julie. Hi,
You want
everyone.
me, well, go ahead, Heidi.
Yeah, I was just gonna, Doris, I was gonna toss it back to you quickly. First of all, it's really nice to be here. I was scrolling the list of places that everyone's calling in from, and it's delightful. So it's really lovely to be here, and means a lot that you all are wanting to spend the time. I want to say that I'm excited for Doris's answer to this question because for those of you who aren't familiar with Doris's history, she's truly a pioneer in setting the course for a lot of the more welcoming, I would say, of U.S. immigration law and policy. And it's a pleasure for me to be here and to learn from her. I think that Doris was alluding to this, but it is not new for there to be dehumanizing rhetoric, for there to be extremist rhetoric, for there to be challenges and controversy around immigration to the United States. And in fact, if you go back to like the early 1920s and you look at some of the signs that were posted on doors, with really hateful slurs against Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, Catholic Irish immigrants coming to the United States, and you compare those to some of the rhetoric coming out of the administration today, there's, sometimes the language is almost exact. That said, I think that the mapping of that rhetoric on increasingly violent policies in the past couple months is new and unprecedented. But if it's okay, I am gonna turn it back to Doris because I'm fascinated to hear her answer on this too.
No, that's great. And I just want to let people who have just joined, because we've had a lot of people come in. Doris Meissner is speaking tonight. She was supposed to be our first speaker, but she's had some Zoom issues. So she's here on audio. So just want to let you guys know if you're wondering why there's no one up on the screen speaking. So Doris, would love to have your answer to that question about, how has immigration been politicized at different parts of our history, or is what are we seeing today new?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Heidi said. I mean, it's just unbelievable what some of the things are that have been said all along. I mean, I took some time this afternoon to look back a little bit at some of the history just to brush up. And it's, in the middle 1800s, there were signs posted all over, "No Irish need apply." The way in which Chinese were treated, that actually you had asked about policies, our first real immigration law had to do with the Chinese who we brought over here and recruited from China to come and help build the railroads. And basically we would not have a cross-national railroad, but for Chinese laborers. But then when the railroad was built, there was no place for them to go. And they were, and people didn't have enough money to go back to China. They were reviled. They were called some of the most terrible names and language, subhuman. It is a period that was overlaid with eugenics and ideas about democracy and capitalism being synonymous with Northern European values. I mean, this goes way back, and it's something that we need to be honest about. It is really built into our DNA as a nation, and that may be the case for other societies as well. I mean, I I do think at the end of the day that immigration is one of the most complicated, difficult things that we do as a nation. Overall, over time, we've done it successfully, but it has never been easy, and it never will be easy. It is a phenomenon that is rosy when you're looking at it through the rear view mirror, but when it is actually happening and when you are looking forward, it can be very, very difficult. Today, though, I would say that in addition to the policies that Heidi is pointing to, and we'll probably get to them more, it's technology and communications and the way in which information travels that amplifies all of these things, which in earlier times would have been every bit as vicious but more localized.
So how have immigration enforcement and border policies changed from the past decades up to now? What changes have we seen?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say that we're in a period now of hyper enforcement from the standpoint of resources. I mean, first of all, we have to remember that as a country, we had open immigration until the 1920s. So people love to say, oh, my grandparents came legally. You know, why don't people today come legally? And we can get to that and talk about that more. We should talk about it more. But we had no restrictions on immigration until a law that was passed in 1924, with the exception of Chinese immigration. That law passed in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act. So open immigration was the way in which people came, and they came by ship. And so you basically had recruiters that went to different countries in order to bring people, to attract people to come to the United States for work purposes, to get labor. And you did not have things like the Southwest, the U.S.-Mexico border. I mean, the whole, until 1848, the whole Southwest was part of Mexico. So the issues of enforcement that we see today that have to do with the Southwest border, particularly, are quite recent, and they did not really, they did not really become much of an issue for the country until after the Second World War. During that time, we had what was called braceros, a labor program with Mexico, and so people went back and forth fairly freely. They weren't all actually part of the bracero program, but they were seen to be so. So we did have one big, huge immigration enforcement crackdown in the 1950s. I don't even want to name it because it's a word we don't use now, but it was called Operation Wetback. And that was a big, big roundup of people to send back to Mexico. But until the 1980s, 90s, enforcement was quite spotty. But in the 1980s and 90s, for a variety of reasons, but in particular with 9/11, the resources invested in immigration enforcement have really skyrocketed. We now spend more on immigration enforcement as a country than we spend on all other federal criminal law enforcement. In other words, the FBI, the DEA, the ATF, all of those put together get less enforcement appropriations than immigration does. And so the whole inflection point of 9/11 and equating or really placing immigration into the Department of Homeland Security, viewing it as an issue of national security and anti-terrorism, as compared with what prior to that time was the Justice Department's civilian law enforcement function, has dramatically changed the enforcement picture. That combines with laws that were passed in 1996, which vastly expanded the grounds for deportation from the country, made many, many more crimes put people subject to deportation, and called for things like mandatory detention, et cetera, that led to a real prison complex surrounding immigration. All of those parts of immigration enforcement now are quite recent. They really date back only 20, 25 years.
Heidi, is there anything you want to add to that? Or I know Doris is very thorough. So for those of you who are just joining, because we still have people joining, one of our speakers had some Zoom difficulties, so she's here on audio only. So that's why you're seeing us sit here silently and listen. So just her knowledge is vast. So we definitely want to include all that, get you all of that information. So can you share some of the common misperceptions or misconceptions, I should say, people have about how immigration actually works today? Especially what I hear all the time from people is, well, people just have to get in line or just sign up. And I think there's a perception that people can just fill out a form and be in America in a short time frame. Can you kind of explain how that process actually works?
I'm going to give Heidi some airtime here.
Sure. Yes. So we love to debunk the myth of just get in line, because the truth is that there's no line to get in. So I can talk a little bit about that. You know, I'm going to just start. I looked up some timelines before the call tonight, right? So if you were a United States citizen living here in the United States and you wanted your brother or sister to come join you in the United States, and you had applied in January of 2008 for your brother or sister to do so, you'd still be waiting today. So I'm just going to say that again. If you'd applied in 2008, you would still be waiting today. So they are currently processing visa applications for brothers and sisters of adult U.S. citizens to join their loved ones here in the United States that were submitted in August of 2007. The reason why I give that as an example, and there's other categories like that, is that it is very difficult to go through the family reunification process to come to the United States lawfully. It takes many, many years, so many years that people often die while waiting, or circumstances change in their family life such that they're no longer able to leave. There are also bars that make it very, very difficult for people who have already come to the United States to do anything that might resemble getting in line. So for example, if you were, say, brought here as a child with your parents, but you entered without a visa, even if you then marry a US citizen, you cannot apply to regularize your status, get your green card and citizenship, unless you take the risk of leaving the country and apply from outside the country. And if you do that, you'll be subject to a 10-year bar to return. So I think it's a common myth that, oh, you just marry a US citizen and you can get your green card. But in fact, even in that case, you could be risking a 10-year or longer separation from your spouse and potentially your children if you get in that so-called line. So those are just a couple examples. And this is just because Congress hasn't acted on immigration in so long that the current mechanisms are really woefully out of date. The other thing I'll say in terms of sort of pathways that are and aren't available for people to come to the United States right now is that the reality of global migration, and we may touch on this a little bit later, has radically changed in the past few years. And, you know, we feel like here in the United States, we're living in our own crisis, but in fact, the entire world is dealing with a global crisis of displaced persons, you know, from a variety of factors, right? But instability and violence and climate change that is causing displacement. More people are on the move globally than we've ever seen. And what that means is that our very old, outdated laws don't reflect the reality of the reasons why some people do desperately need to come to the United States, whether that's to reunify with their family, which goes to the wait times that I mentioned at the beginning, or because their lives might be at risk where they are. The only way to come, really, if you are fleeing a situation like that, is to go through the refugee resettlement program or to try to arrive at a border and seek asylum. And that we can talk a little bit more about it, but the laws that determine whether someone can get access to the refugee or the asylum systems were developed after World War II and are very much sort of evocative of the ways in which people were persecuted during the Holocaust. So, I'll give a very brief example because I think sometimes humanizing these things helps a little bit. During the last administration, I traveled down to the border and I met with people who were waiting on the Mexico side of the border to try to seek asylum in the United States. And I talked to a lot of them. And one of the stories that really stuck with me was this man who was in a wheelchair. He had actually been a standby victim of a shooting. So he was in sort of the wrong place at the wrong time and he was shot. He ended up in the hospital and quite disabled. And because of the political instability in Venezuela, which is the country he was from, the economy there, some of you may have read about it, was so destabilized that there's no safety net programming for people who end up. And so he was completely unable to get employment. And his family had no way to get any kind of support while they were trying to pay for his medical services. They were trying to subsist on literally $0 a week. And he was afraid that his wife and 3 children, who were all with him under the age of 5, were literally going to die of starvation. He left while in a wheelchair in need of emergency surgery in order to try to save his children and his wife from literal starvation. The refugee definition that we currently have doesn't reflect that kind of instability and devastating economic destabilization that we're seeing across the globe. And so in that situation, when you hear about people trying to quote unquote manipulate or abuse the asylum system, in my experience from having met with a lot of people in that circumstance, what we're really talking about is not an attempt to abuse or manipulate the system, but a very real desperate need for protection that doesn't match our existing laws. And so, at NILC, we and many other organizations are thinking through and presenting and trying to get members of Congress to get interested in developing new pathways that would be available to people, either in their country or a neighboring country, allow them to come to the United States in a much more safe way. So those are some of the ways in which, there is no line, and it really is very, very challenging for people, whether in the United States or desperately needing to get to the United States, are able to avail themselves of status, and why we have this very large and vulnerable population of undocumented people.
Doris, you've been working in this area for, decades. Please, anything you want to add on to what Heidi said? And then also, I would just love to hear what you think are the biggest challenges or failures of our current system, and what could we be doing? What could be better?
Well, I was so interested, Heidi, that what you said. There's no line. That's always my first response to the question that people say exactly that. Why don't they just do it legally? Maybe it'd be helpful to say that we do have a functioning legal immigration system. We bring about 1 million people a year to the country legally under our legal immigration system. But it is, as Heidi said, not aligned anymore with the realities on the ground and the way the world has changed. I mean, those 1 million people that come every year legally, 2/3 of them come because they have a family member in the United States. We have a very strong value embedded in our immigration system of family unification. And we put family unification as the most important priority for legal immigration into our system in 1965 as a way of replacing what had been up till then called the national origins system, which meant that that basically people from Asia and Latin America did not have access to the immigration system. So family immigration replaced that in 1965, which was at the time a real advance. It overcame a very discriminatory system. But that has left not a lot of room for other categories of people to come to the country. Now, refugees come, as Heidi said, about 15% of our immigration is refugees. That number varies, but only about 7 or 8% are people who come for employment-based reasons. And we have an economy, particularly now that we are an aging society, where for the first time demographically, we actually have a situation where the growth in our labor force and the growth in our labor, younger workers coming into the job market, which is essential, again, for productivity, that is all immigrant workers. Those are all people who are foreign-born. And many of those foreign-born workers are in the country illegally because we do not have a system of visas that allows for people to come legally for employment purposes. I agree with Heidi that protection needs have changed, and that the way in which the refugee definition is limited is a problem, but an awful lot of the people who are coming would be much more willing and motivated to come for a work visa, sometime, in some cases, circularity, one where you can go back and forth, but in many other cases, a permanent visa. And Congress simply has not, as Heidi says, dealt with that issue. So much of what is now unauthorized illegal immigration is actually our failure to have an immigration system that actually makes it possible for us to bring immigrants in for which we have either a very important protection or a labor market reason.
Thank you. That's interesting, because I think people have this perception that, like, oh, companies just bring people in and we can bring people in to work when we need them and seasonally. And the family issues too, about like how long some people have to wait to actually be reunited with families, I think is really important to understand. Heidi, I'm going to turn to you though. I think you've mentioned a lot of phrases here: refugees, asylum. Can you kind of just define for people some of those, like what is an asylum seeker? What is someone refugee status? What does it mean just to be undocumented? Because I think there's a perception, because it's purposely been, I think, disinformation. If you come here and seek asylum, that means you're here illegally. And I want to kind of clear those phrases up.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I made a little list here for us to go through to try to understand some definitions. An asylum seeker is someone who comes to the United States and either arrives at an airport or a port of entry and says, I'm afraid to go back to my home. I would like to seek asylum in the United States. You can also do that from inside the United States. So, like, let's say that you came here on a student visa, and while you're here, there's a coup in your country, and you're now a political dissident, and you cannot go back. You could then make an application for asylum once you're already in the United States. There is a 1-year filing deadline, though, so you have to make that application within 1 year of arriving, unless there is a changed circumstance, like that kind of coup example that I just mentioned. So then if you win and you get asylum, you are what's called an asylee. And asylees do have a path to getting a green card and eventual citizenship. In order to get asylum status, you have to show that you meet the definition of being a refugee, which is someone who, if you're returned to your country of your origin, you'd be persecuted or harmed on the basis of what we call a protected ground, which is something about you that you either can't or shouldn't be forced to change. And those can be either your religion, your race, your nationality, your political opinion, or something called particular social group, which really means, again, there's something about you that you shouldn't be forced to change. So common particular social group, for example, would be LGBTQ people from a particular country. The definition that you have to meet to show you're an asylee is the same definition that people have to meet to get refugee status, except the difference is that you seek to become a refugee from outside of the United States. So you may have just fled a war situation and you are in a refugee camp, and usually through a United Nations agency, you make an application to be granted refugee status. And if you're found to meet that definition and you go through lots of security and safety vetting, then you can be resettled as a refugee in the United States. And there too, you have a pathway to a green card and citizenship. So a green card, which I've mentioned a couple times, is like the most permanent and lasting form of immigration status short of citizenship in the United States, also referred to as lawful permanent residence. People can get lawful permanent residence either as a step after asylum or refugee status, or you can be brought here through your U.S. citizen spouse or another family member or an employer. Is another sort of body of statuses that are more temporary and leave people more vulnerable. You may have heard of temporary protected status, for example, which is a status where you are from a country that the president says things in this country are so unstable right now because of an earthquake, because of generalized violence, whatever it might be, that we can't conscionably send people back there. And you've seen, and it's been very tragic under this administration, that, sort of one by one, as temporary protected statuses are expiring, the administration is not renewing them, even when the conditions in those countries remain life-threatening. Another temporary form of status is DACA, which most people are familiar with, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, right? Which is for Dreamers, people who were brought to the United States as children. Many of them are no longer youth. Many of them are like in their 30s, I think even early 40s now. And like TPS, DACA recipients do not have permanent protection from deportation. They have temporary protection from deportation and work authorization. Then we have people who are here on valid visas. So that could be people who are here, on a work visa or a student visa. And then we have the remainder of the undocumented population, which could be people who came on a temporary visa or a longer term visa and then stayed after their permission to stay expired. Or it could be people who entered without, being inspected or without having permission to be here and were able to make their way in and have stayed here. And that is, you'll hear different figures, 10 million, 11 million people. So those are the categories.
Thank you. I think that helps to clarify a lot. And I think one thing people don't recognize is that I think there is misinformation pushed that people who are coming here are crossing the border illegally, coming into the country, and they don't talk about overstaying visas, like just how many people get off an airplane with the visa and just don't leave, right? Or come, and I think it used to be actually, and you can correct me, I thought that actually was the majority of people who were here, was coming overstaying visas, and I think that might have changed, but you can correct me on that if I'm wrong.
I don't actually
It's
know
very
that
hard.
current. Do you know, Doris, offhand?
Yeah, I mean, the visa overstay numbers are numbers that have always been difficult to figure out, but it's been as high as 40% of the unauthorized population, but I don't think it's that high now. But it is a significant part of the unauthorized population, but they're people from all over the world, and so it's not as evident as the populations that came across the U.S.-Mexico border, who are typically, until very recently, from Latin American countries, and so look in one way or another Latino. For overstays, you have a lot of Irish overstays, you have a lot of Canadian overstays, you have a lot of foreign student overstays, and so it's a much less visible population.
I know that we started a little bit late, and I know we also want to have some time for Q&A. So please, if you do have questions, drop them in the chat. We'll try to get to as many as we can. Maybe we'll run a little over since we did start late. I want to talk about the thing that obviously everyone is thinking about now is these deportations without due process. And Heidi, can you tell us a little bit, what is the process supposed to be, and just what's going on now with people just basically being taken off the street and shipped out of the country?
Yeah, and this is where I'm going to ask everybody to like sit up and really for a moment think about the ways in which you can speak out on this issue. This is really a classic issue. It's like said so many times that it's become a little bit rote, but first they came for, and then they came for. And what we are seeing now is the Trump administration experimenting on immigrant communities with a tremendously devastating, rapid deprivation of civil liberties and due process rights, accompanied by explicit threats to use those same authorities against U.S. citizens. So we are, really urging everyone to think about this issue in the light of the threat of rising authoritarianism and to speak out about it in that way. I'm gonna try to break down a little bit what we're seeing, and then compare it, as you asked, Julie, to how the system kind of is supposed to be. We have talked at NILC a lot about what words do we use for this, and I just want to say really briefly that the way I started my career was working with refugees and asylum seekers from West African and Central African countries who were political dissidents. And that was 20 years ago. And I am having these really painful moments when I read the newspaper and read about what the United States is doing to our immigrant neighbors. And I hear echoes of what those political dissidents told me were happening to them and their friends and their colleagues in authoritarian countries that they were forced to flee for fear of their own lives. We're seeing a few patterns. So starting a couple months ago now, we started hearing rumors of students who were here on student visas, but in some cases, lawful permanent residents. And some of you may have heard of the case of Mahmoud Khalil, which was like the first most prominent case, being kind of taken off the street, quite frankly, abducted, and being whisked away despite being here on lawful status, having quote unquote done everything right, and taken into immigration detention centers, which really are private prisons and county jails that contract with immigration. They are, for the most part, having these allegations slapped against them, which are very vague allegations, usually in connection with them having exercised their protected free speech rights to engage in advocacy on campus or elsewhere connected to Israel and the war in Gaza. There's one video that if you have not seen, it is hard and you should take a breath before you watch it. But I do recommend that everyone wanting to understand the moment and we're living in, watch this video of a woman named Rumeysa Ozturk, who is a student, a PhD student at Tufts, who was actually on the way to the Interfaith Center on her campus on Tufts to break her Ramadan fast. And you can see in the video a man not identified as police or immigration in a hooded sweatshirt come up to her and literally just abduct her into a black SUV. And she is screaming. And she was then taken away and is still fighting her immigration case from detention. That category of sort of what we're thinking of as abductions or disappearances, quite honestly, is happening at the same time that the administration has invoked a wartime power called the Alien Enemies Act, which was, last used during World War II for the internment of Japanese Americans and others, to essentially take people the government claims may be affiliated with a particular gang that they have designated as a foreign terrorist organization. It's called Tren de Aragua. And without any due process, without ever seeing an immigration judge or any other kind of immigration adjudicator, they are being put on a plane and sent to a mega prison in El Salvador. The United States literally has a written agreement with the government of El Salvador to take people as they arrive and put them in this prison. This is a prison that is notorious for human rights abuses and for torture. Human rights experts who know this prison well say that no one has ever been released from this prison. It is not a place you walk out of. Some of the people sent there were sent there under this invocation of the Alien Enemies Act. Other people were sent there with a deportation order, but to Venezuela, not to El Salvador, and who then, without having any chance to ask a judge to protect them from deportation to El Salvador, were sent there. We believe there's about 300 people who the United States, we think this meets the legal definition of having been rendered to torture, quite literally. There was another flight that was very close to being sent to this prison in El Salvador over the weekend, and some of you may have seen that the Supreme Court stopped this. Quite briefly, because I know we're short on time, what quote unquote should happen, what is supposed to happen is when the US government decides to start a deportation case against someone, they may detain them or they may not detain them. And they will issue a charging document. It's called a notice to appear, and they get to have an immigration court case. And they get to see an immigration judge and make any defense to their deportation that might be applicable, including, for example, if they believe they will be tortured or persecuted in the country that they're to be deported from. There are many, many opportunities that the United States has under existing legal authorities to bring deportation proceedings, criminal charges, you name it, against people if they truly believe them to be a public safety threat. What I want to say here is that this complete stripping away of due process is the piece that, we know is really resonating, because we know it could happen to any of us, right? Once there is this precedent of being able to send somebody to, essentially a black hole site without any opportunity to contest it, and then the administration claiming, in this case that many of you have read about, that's gone up to the Supreme Court, that they have no ability to get that person back once they're there. This is actually sort of classic fascist behavior. And it is a definitely a canary in the coal mine. Hopefully we can talk at the end about steps we think people can be taking there.
I was gonna say, if you don't mind, I would really like to get to some of the questions. And I saw, Chris in the chat was saying we need another meeting on this. We absolutely do. There's so much to cover here. So many questions, especially right now. So Julie, I'm gonna bring you up and we're gonna start digging into the questions in the chat, and maybe we'll hang on for an extra 10 or so minutes just to try to answer as many as we can. And Doris, just kind of we'll start off here with Heidi because she's on screen, and we'll kind of popcorn anything over to you that you wanna jump in on here.
Okay.
So one of the first questions that we received was from a poster who came over during a time when quotas was the system of immigration that we use. And they were asking, what do we use today? Seems a little chaotic.
Well, I mean, we do have quotas. We do still have quotas, but they are based on, but they're numerical quotas. I mean, the way I describe the legal immigration system, the 2/3 of people who come as family members, depending on what your relationship is. For instance, if you are the U.S. citizen, if you are the spouse of a U.S. citizen, there is no quota that limits that number of people. But if you are the brother or sister of a U.S. citizen, there is a quota that limits that number of people. The immigration laws are very complicated and convoluted. So certain categories of the immigrants who come under the legal immigration system are subject to quotas. When I was talking about the fact that there are not sufficient visas by any means for employment-related purposes, that is under a quota. The quota for employment-based immigration is a very low quota. It's 140,000 a year out of the million, but of that 140,000 a year out of the million, it includes their family members. So the actual workers are only about 70,000. That's an example of a quota, and so it applies. It therefore applies almost entirely to high-skilled people. So yes, we do have quotas for many categories, and then we also have some flexibility. Refugee admissions, for instance, those numbers can be set year by year. So there's a quota on refugee admissions, but it can be adjusted year by year. All of the other quotas that are in the current immigration laws were fixed many years ago, some as long ago as 1965.
Okay, be careful of many years. That's the year I was born. Did the administration close the application for citizenship process?
No, but they are adjudicating citizenship applications. But they are also laying off a lot of people. The immigration agencies have not suffered the kinds of layoffs that things like USAID have, but we're beginning to see signs slow walking some categories of applications, but not yet citizenship.
In our current, is the current administration trying to change the old laws to reflect their agenda?
Heidi can speak to this too. I mean, they're not changing laws. they're not abiding by laws, I would say. I mean, in the immigration realm, in the way that Heidi just explained, they are not in any way abiding by the procedures that are required and the rights that are established in law. But we desperately need the Congress to act on immigration laws, but this administration has not made any proposals to Congress in that regard. They're focused entirely right now on mass deportations as one of the promises that the president made in the campaign.
So
Yeah,
during that,
sorry, Julie, can I add one quick thing to that? We do want everyone to know about one bill, though, that is moving right now in Congress, which is the budget package moving. You may hear it referred to as the reconciliation bill, because that's the technical process that is used to pass budget bills. Through this budget, Congress is trying to pass a budget of up to $350 billion that will be used for more things like this agreement for El Salvador to imprison people, more immigration jails, more enforcement, more disappearances of students. It will literally be a game changer and allow the kind of immigration enforcement I don't think we can even imagine right now. I'm going to put an action item that we have on our website in the chat. If there's one thing you do when you leave this meeting, my ask would be to call your senators and your member of the House tomorrow and say, please start speaking out right now in opposition to the budget bill that will supercharge immigration detentions and disappearances. And I'll drop the resource in that has that language.
You're ready to ask. Oh, someone asked about a potential impact of climate change in increasing the need for immigration because the countries that these folks live in are becoming inhospitable to human life and to the traditional ways people have made a living or sustain their lives. So I don't know that there's any provision for that because, like you said, it seems like they're doing these mass deportations and that's the focus.
Well, you know, Heidi spoke about global mobility and about global displacement and people on the move, and some of that displacement certainly is now commingled with climate issues and changing weather issues and much more. You know, when in Central America, for instance, if a hurricane hits, it will be much more intense and disastrous, as is the case in the United States. There will be a lot of climate migration, and already is in the United States, just domestically. You know, you think of Arizona last year that had how many 60 days in a row of 100 degrees or more. I don't remember the numbers, but they're dramatic. So the climate issue is definitely going to contribute to displacement and to mobility. My own view is that it is a mistake to talk about things like climate refugees or even climate provisions in immigration laws. The climate issue is so overarching. It involves everything in our lives and the lives of our planet, in the you know, ability to survive, that there need to be much bigger answers than simply the answers that immigration systems can bring to it.
I'm going to combine two because I don't know how many more questions that we're going to do, but somebody asked, during the time that you're waiting for asylum, what do you do for money? And then someone else asked, what benefits, you know, like Social Security or, you know, TANF or any of those kinds of benefits are these folks eligible to receive? Because those seem to be really big questions that a lot of folks have to have.
Well, while people are waiting for their asylum claims to be determined, if they have filed for asylum, they need there is a provision in the law that after 6 months of filing an application, you're eligible for a work authorization form. And that used to make sense because some years ago we actually were able to adjudicate asylum claims within that 6-month period, but that 6-month period got written into the statute. And so getting a work authorization, it's known as an employment authorization document, an EAD, after 6 months allows people to work legally while their claim is pending. You know, during that first 6 months, generally people simply find a way to either know people in the United States, or they get connected with churches, faith groups, other local organizations that can be helpful until they're eligible for their work authorization. As to eligibility for other benefits, Heidi, you're going to be better at this than I am. Can you tick off what the other eligibility is?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I just dropped a guide on a link that's on our website in the chat, which will make you a little dizzy if you open it up. The long story short, if you don't want to dig in, is that most undocumented folks do not have access to benefits other than the ability to go to an emergency room and get, you know, emergency Medicaid. People who have lawful status, like lawful permanent residents, do begin to get access to more benefits, but even there's usually a 5-year waiting period. So access to benefits is quite restricted for immigrants, despite you know, what some elected officials would have us believe. And I will just make a note that that is extremely bad for everyone, right? Like, the way public health works is that we are all more healthy and we are all more secure when everyone is able to access vaccinations and preventive care and all the kinds of basic supports that we need in our communities. So, you know, that's been a policy battle for many, many, many years.
Let me add something to that, because you are a question like that, I think, comes from the experiences that people are seeing around the country, and it has been a real source of tension and resentment that somehow people illegally in the country, or people who just got here and are applying for asylum, are eligible for benefits that people who have been here for a long time are not eligible for. Typically, that because there are strong limitations on, as Heidi said, on where the eligibility is. But at the same time, so we have had such a long-standing unauthorized population now. I mean, we have the unauthorized population now is about 13. The latest numbers are about 13.7 million. That means that about 1 in 4 people who are in the country as foreign-born, because our foreign-born population is now about 48 million, about 1 in 4 are unauthorized, don't have a legal status. And that, for, you know, we're a nation of immigrants, we're also a nation of laws. That is a really, really indefensible position that we're in. And many of those people lived in what's called mixed households. And so if they live in mixed households, and typically the mixed household will be that maybe one member of the household is a lawful permanent resident, has a green card, or is a U.S. citizen. More typically, that some of the children in the family would have been born in the U.S., and they therefore are U.S. citizens. And so they are eligible for benefits in the way that any other U.S. citizen is. But because they're in mixed households, their household benefits, i.e. some people who are unauthorized, from the rights that U.S. citizen has. And that often causes an enormous amount of resentment about the notion that somehow or another people unauthorized in the country are getting treated better than U.S. citizens.
Is there a book or a primer that you can recommend to folks to, you know, read more about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the frequently asked questions document that I sent you that I think you're going to be distributing after this program will give a lot of that information.
I did just drop in the chat from the Migration Policy Institute some links to some explainers, so I will send those in an email tomorrow. Just don't feel like you have to copy it all right now. Heidi, do you have any?
If you want a book, like a long book that also has a delightful audio book available, I really recommend Everyone Who Has Gone Is Here by Jonathan Blitzer. And I will flag that the first few chapters are an extremely compelling profile of one Doris Meissner and her involvement and leadership and pioneering in the immigration movement and in the government. But it also provides a really sweeping, I think, like a postmortem of how we got to this place today.
You're very kind, Heidi. Thank you.
So I saw in the chat someone wrote, and I know that this has been a topic of discussion both at work and in my home. As a person of color, should we be carrying around our birth certificates, passports, etc., to prove that we are American citizens, lest we get stopped on the street?
I have to tell you, more and more people are doing it. The most compelling case I've heard of, I have a colleague who is married a long time to a U.S. citizen who is Mexican, and she says that now when she leaves the house, she's been in this country for 30 years as a U.S. citizen. When she leaves the house now, her children all the time ask her, Mommy, have you taken your passport with you? Don't go out without your passport. That's how this is, affecting people at the working level. What I would say is don't risk carrying your passport, but take a picture of it, your passport, and if you don't have one, your birth certificate, your key documents, keep pictures of them on your iPhone so that you have proof just in case.
Julie, can I just, while you're scanning, can I just add really quickly, there's a couple questions in the chat about, my senator is a reliable Democrat. I just wanted to urge everyone, please be calling your members regularly, even if they are a reliable champion. There is a lot of misinformation on the Hill about polling and about what Americans think and don't think about immigration. And even your champions and our champions and immigrant communities champions need to hear the outrage and the growing concern to be able to know that they have you at their back. It is critical. I cannot emphasize it enough that we need you to make those calls regardless of whether you think, my senator's got it. That's great. Tell them to keep up the fight and be louder.
Great. I want to just wrap up with one last question, and that is just, I know people come and they want to know what they can do. And we're hearing you right now, Heidi. It is call your representatives, call your senators, tell them you care about this, you're paying attention, you do have their back. Anything else that you want to do, and then we'll let Doris do a quick answer and wrap this up.
Well, depending on where you are around the country, there are some parts of the country that are being more affected by this mass deportations issue than others, and it has to do with the degree to which jurisdictions are cooperating with the federal government or not. But there is just a tremendous amount of good work that's being done, particularly by schools and by faith communities and by local legal services organizations and other community groups to be in touch with migrant communities, immigrant communities, and not only and be supportive. The most important thing right now that can happen is that people know lawyers that they can call who are available and can respond if, in fact, there is trouble. This issue of due process, and even if things are stopped by some of the courts and Supreme Court decisions, etc., even nonetheless, the time that's available for people to actually get legal support help in immigration proceedings is very small. And so the efforts that have been made at the community level on what's called Know Your Rights, and helping to be sure that leaders and others in immigrant communities are plugged into where they can get legal support. I think that is extremely helpful and relevant right now.
Anything else, Heidi, besides blowing up your members of Congress and phone?
Blow up the phone lines, and if you feel comfortable doing so, consider distributing Know Your Rights materials in your communities, at your schools, in your neighborhoods, at your place of worship, and we'll be sending a few that you can use to easily do that.
So I want to thank Heidi so much. We could have talked for like another 2 hours and still not got to all of your questions. So we will definitely be doing another immigration event. So thank you so much to Heidi for joining us, and for Doris. We appreciate her doing all the things she could to get in and at least getting it on audio for us. We appreciate that. Thank you for submitting your questions, and we hope to see you again at another event really soon. Everyone have a great evening.
Thanks, Al.
Thanks for what you're doing. Good night.